Stories, they shape us. They have the power to transport us, to illuminate truths that we often overlook, and connect us to something that is greater than ourselves. This week, we step into one of the oldest and most profound stories ever told. It's the story of Cain and Abel. And it's a story that's echoed through history, not just as a tale of two brothers, but as a deep reflection on the human condition. But this isn't just an ancient story. It's a window into who we are, a glimpse into our relationship with God, and a lesson in the tension between pride and humility, between faith and rebellion. It challenges us to wrestle with questions of justice, of mercy, and of the choices we make in the face of sin. Together, we'll explore how this story speaks across time, connecting the beginning of Genesis to the hope of the New Testament and beyond. So, let's pull on this thread together as we uncover something new about this timeless tale. My interest has really been accruing around the Genesis stories as of late, and I notoriously have taught a lot from New Testament passages, but I've been developing a fondness for these beautiful stories that we have in Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament. So my hope is to work through these stories and be making parallels to the New Testament, because there is a beautiful connectivity that they share. And I'm starting off in Genesis 4 because I have forbidden myself from doing anything in the first 3 chapters of Genesis for a while. And not for anything except that I have beat the horse to death, and I know it. But I'm extremely excited to explore these foundational stories that are happening after the first 3 chapters of Genesis and into the Old Testament. And it's in a series that I am calling Biblical History. Notice that I'm just putting the emphasis on the word story. We're hoping to restore this concept of story to these things in Genesis, these wild stories in Genesis that we're reading. It's the emphasis on the word story, and that's actually the first key to understanding them, right? It's that they are stories. Now, you've heard me say this before, I'm sure that you have. But just because something is a story doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherently untrustworthy or false, right? Any good interpretation of ancient texts, like the one that we're going to be evaluating in Genesis 4, does a good job, or it doesn't lose the forest for the trees. Its main focus is on authorial intent. That's what we want to make sure that we're doing. So when we're looking at this story of Cain and Abel, we have to understand it through the lens of anthropology, or the study of humans and their nature and how they think. And we're going to read this, but I want to prime the story with context, because it's really easy to get sidetracked with the minutia, the concrete details, because that's just how we've been trained to think. That's what we've been trained to look at in the 21st century. But this breakdown of Cain and Abel, it's not just a critical evaluation of the brush strokes, right? But I want it to be an appreciation for the painting as a whole, for the story as a whole. And so first of all, this is history, right? But not the history that you and I were taught in school. The Israelite children, they weren't given quizzes with multiple choice questions about the facts of Genesis. This history was meant and is meant to transmit a wealth of meaning for all types of people, right? This is why these stories, they're so effective and they're so enduring. And I'm sure you've encountered something similar when going through the Bible, thumbing through its pages, but just one story can be a one-size-fits-all lesson. Like, the youngest child is taking something from it. The oldest man, he's taking something from it. And everybody in between that, they're going to take something out of the story. And you can reread the Bible every year if you'd like, but you're going to encounter something seemingly new or fresh every time that you see it, because you're reading it from a different perspective in life, which is not something that's very common anymore when it comes to history. Like, largely, we've taken the story out of history. George Washington crossing the Delaware feels almost exactly the same today as it did back when I was in grade school, you know? But there's a very different experience when we read these narratives from Genesis. History for us today, it's very one-dimensional, right? It feels like it either happened or it didn't. You answer the question, it's either A, B, C, or D, and it's right or it's wrong. And if we're not careful, we read the Bible one-dimensionally as well, because that's just how we've been conditioned to do it our whole lives. But the story is calling for us in every stage of life, through every background, every demographic. It's calling for us to be immersed in it, to enter into the experience and learn something about God and human nature that transcends the cold, hard facts, right? This is why the Bible is described as something that is living and active, because there's something underneath the words that we're reading, that we're memorizing. There's something underneath all that that's warm and living and welcoming. And we're going to take that idea and we're going to bring it to the text, okay? Now, I'm going to be reading out of the Net Bible, or the New English translation. And I'm telling you that because this has been the most beneficial translation for me when reading the Old Testament. Its primary focus is on transparency, meaning that it translates probably some things differently than what you might be used to, but it's packed full of notes that are explaining like the difficult choices that had to be made in the translation process. So it actually gives alternative interpretations, and you won't see it because the notes are off to the side over here. I can see them. But it gives alternative interpretations in the notes, and it's weighing the linguistic and contextual probabilities of each interpretation, and it's putting forth the translation that seems to have the highest textual reliability. It's actually quite rigorous and transparent, which is why I rely on it when doing studies around some of these ancient writings that humanity has. But if you have any questions about what we're reading, maybe it sounds a little bit different than what you're used to or what you're reading, please leave a comment. You can send me a message. You can call me or whatever it is. I would love to talk with you. Yeah, I would love to talk with you about it. That's what I do for fun, and probably to the chagrin of my wife. But I might bore you to death, but we'd have fun. I'd have fun. But anyway, those are the two things, right? The translation might be a little bit different than what you're used to, and we'll do our best to explain it when it varies. But also, the stories are very multi-dimensional. Let's not read it with one dimension. So let's take that. Let's bring it to the text. But I'm pretty sure that's all that I had to say before we get into Genesis 4:1. It says in Genesis 4:1, "Now the man, Adam, had marital relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son." Okay, just as quick as that, right? Doesn't take 9 months. It's that simple. That's not true. I had a pregnant wife. It's a lot longer than that. I wish it was this easy. But then she said, "I have created a man just as the Lord did." Okay, pause. This is one of those deviations that I was talking about that may be quite different from what you have always read. It says, "I have created a man just as the Lord did." And this is kind of an alternative translation, but it's providing a powerful lens or perspective into Eve's response of having a baby. You have to remember, this is the first time that any human being was created outside of God creating man. So this is what the story's trying to tell us. And so Eve's trying to interpret what's happening. There's a child pops out. This has never happened before in history. We have the benefit of knowing that women get pregnant and they have children, but they didn't, right? So by understanding the Hebrew particle of et, it means with or like, and it's in reference to working together with God to create a child, or being like God in creating a child, right? So this translation highlights Eve's awe at participating in creation, but it's also hinting at a misunderstanding that she has, right? She views her role as something parallel to God's, which is subtly reflecting the pride and self-exaltation that's foreshadowing Cain's actions that are about to happen in the story. But this interpretation fits the narrative themes of pride versus humility far better than the alternative, which kind of claims that Eve believed Cain was the Messiah. It's working off the idea that she gave birth to a son, and it was prophesied that his heel would bruise the head of the snake. This really interesting thing, but if we were to interpret it in light of that reading kind of imposes an allegorical framework that's not really supported by the texts. Instead, this translation underscores this human tendency to blur the dependence on God with self-reliance, and that's a thread that's woven throughout the story of Cain and Abel. So That's why it would choose to interpret it that way as opposed to the other ways that you might have read it. But by capturing this tension, this interpretation reveals Genesis 4:1. It's not just Eve's statement of wonder, but also a profound setup for the relational struggles with God that follow this. But as a separate note, I also want to clarify a common thing that I hear some people talk about, and it's that God has a feminine or motherly side. And I mention that because Eve is saying, I've created a man just as the Lord did, right? And so a lot of people might take this and talk about God's feminine side, his creative side. But God doesn't have a feminine or a masculine side, right? Feminine and masculine are words that we use to describe a large-scale deviation of the human race into two sexes. They're characteristics or identifiers that are common or typical to one sex or the other. So saying that God has a motherly side or a feminine side would be similar to if you looked at me and you said, man, Russell, you look just like your sons. Like, right, that's kind of true. I know what you're trying to say, but my sons actually look like me because they came from me, right? I don't look like my sons. And likewise, motherly and feminine characteristics shouldn't really be applied to God because God is not like us. We are like him. And I say that because there's an aspect of God's identity that is unique to women. But we don't flip it around and say there's an aspect of a woman's identity that is unique to God. It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. But it's this ability to bring life into the world or to bear a child, as exhibited by Eve's exclamation in this passage, I have created a man just as the Lord did. That's a characteristic that she pulled from God. It's not a characteristic that God has pulled from woman. All right, I just wanted to clarify that. But let's continue in verse 2. Then she gave birth to his brother, Abel. Just as quick as that, it wasn't hard. Abel took care of the flocks, or he took care of the animals, while Cain cultivated the ground, right? He was tilling the ground, he was weeding things. Okay, that's the image that we get. And these are some important details that really help give this story some meaning. So we're going to pause and talk about this, because I think some people, when we read it in our modern way, they mix a couple of things up. It's important to note this. Cain is the firstborn brother. And it is preferential to be the firstborn brother during this time, right? You get the whole inheritance, or at least the largest share of it. You get the father's blessing. You're seen as the leader of the family. You're going to be the future of the family. You're going to lead the house. It is an esteemed position to be in. And Cain, he's also the one that grows the crops. Now, growing the crops is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. Farming is actually the preferred job from what we can see in the Bible. If you think about David's relegation to shepherding while his brothers are brought before Samuel to be chosen as the king, right? It's the last brother that gets relegated to the poorest job. Now, taking care of the animals, it's the second son's job, so to speak. But we'll begin to see this pattern throughout the Bible that's really established in this story, and it has to do with God's preference for the second son. Not just second by number, it's not just like an arbitrary favoring of the birth order, but because of the humble attributes that naturally develop in an individual that has to learn how to live with being the second fiddle, right? It's a really interesting theme that God over and over again passes over the son or the sons that should be preferred on paper or according to their birthright. So this pattern of God passing over the firstborn son to favor the second or the less likely choice is seen repeatedly throughout the scripture. You've got Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his older brothers, Ephraim over Manasseh, Moses over Aaron, David over his older brother, Solomon over Adonijah, Gideon is seen as the least in his family, even Abraham. He's the youngest of Terah's son, but he's chosen to father the nations. And all of this is culminating with Jesus, who we describe as the second Adam, or in the Jewish way of thinking, he was the second son of God. And what's characteristic of all these names is the humility that naturally comes from their lowly position, right? Abel is no exception. He is the humble. He has the humble job of sitting around and taking care of these stinky, these dumb, frustrating animals. Okay, so keep that in mind as we continue in verse 3. At the designated time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the ground for an offering to the Lord. Okay. an offering, right? Not a sacrifice. This is important to know. He brought it as an offering. But Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flock, and it says two things: even the fattest of them, and it's the firstborn of the flock. So let's keep that noted. And the Lord was pleased with Abel and his offering, but with Cain and his offering, he was not pleased. Okay, we'll pause there. This is important. Why was God displeased with Cain's offering? Right? It's a good question. Was it because Cain's offering was just a lifeless sack of produce, while Abel's offering was a sacrifice of meat and blood, and that's what God wants. God wants life. I think it's a misnomer, right? I don't think that that's the case. I think many people interpret God's displeasure to be due to his preference for a living animal sacrifice, but there's not really a lot of support for that other than conjecture, right? The Hebrew word mincha, which is translated here as offering, it's a general term that means tribute, means gift, dedication. It doesn't mean sacrifice. And it's the same word that's used in Leviticus chapter 2 to describe the dedication offering, which includes vegetables and or grains. So the issue in this story isn't that Cain's offering was made up of crops instead of animals. Vegetables were perfectly acceptable as an offering, right? God wasn't rejecting what Cain offered, right? The real issue was the heart and the attitude of the one bringing the offering. He wasn't rejecting what Cain offered. He was rejecting how Cain offered it, right? And how do we know this? How do we know that this is true? Well, there are two prepositional phrases that are used to qualify the kind of offering that Abel brought, and I pointed them out earlier, right? So the first one is from the firstborn. So he's taking the firstborn of his flock. And the second prepositional phrase is from the fattest of them. So the firstborn and the fattest, right? These two descriptions of Abel's sacrifice are meant to be a contrast against Cain's sacrifice. And the text doesn't really give any details about Cain's sacrifice or offering, other than he brought it, right? So it's conveying this idea that Abel was very intentional with what he brought. He brought the best of the best. And this understanding is really bolstered in the New Testament, right? The letter to the Hebrews explains the difference between the two brothers' offerings. And it uses this concept of faith, right? What does it say? Abel, by faith, offered a better sacrifice. Okay. Cain's offering, as well as his reaction to God's displeasure, did not reflect faith in God. And we see that as we continue in the story, right? Because Cain became angry at the end of the fifth verse. It says, but with Cain and his offering, he was not pleased. So Cain became very angry, and his expression was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why is your expression downcast? Is it not true that if you do what is right, you will be fine? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it. Okay. Here is where it's really important that we clarified why God was displeased with Cain's sacrifice, right? It's not as simple as God going up to Cain and saying, hey buddy, next time if you just bring an animal sacrifice instead of these lousy, lifeless fruits and veggies, you and I'll be good. I'll love you again. I don't think that's what God was trying to communicate with Cain. And indeed, this is probably God's frustration with people throughout the Old Testament, and even the New Testament, probably now today, right? And a verse that I think summarizes this principle is Psalm 51, 16 through 17. This is a foundational, this is an awesome passage that I love to go to. It's understanding of our relationship with God and what we give to God. It says in verse 16, certainly you do not want a sacrifice, or else I would offer it. You do not desire a burnt sacrifice. The sacrifices God desires are a humble spirit. Oh God, a humble and a repentant heart you will not reject. Okay, God's not just asking Cain to do the right thing. This is important because Cain did do the right thing on paper, right? He brought a sacrifice or an offering. He came to worship him. He came to give tribute to God, to recognize him. And he did the right thing on paper, but the intent of his heart was wrong. And this is a principle of the story that still hits home today for many Christians. Yes, there are sinners outside the doors of the church, or any church for that matter, right? They do wrong things and their hearts are in the wrong place. But that's not as dangerous as being in a church and doing the right things, but having a heart that's in the wrong place. And why is that? And I think because it's a lot easier to repent, to turn away, or to change your course of actions. It's a lot easier to do that when both your heart and your actions are saying the same thing. But we become prone to self-deception when our actions say one thing and our heart is saying another, right? Be hot or cold. We're told anything that's in between that is liable to be spewed out of the mouth of God. And this is proven to be true as the story continues in Genesis 4, starting in verse 8, right? It says in verse 8, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out into the field." Don't do it, Cain. Don't do it. We know what's coming. Okay. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel, and he killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, and notice how many times it says brother. It's really hitting home on the word brother here, and that's literally, that's intentional. In verse 9 it says, Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he replied, "I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian?" Yours might say keeper, right? But the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. So now you are banished from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you try to cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its best for you. You will be a homeless wanderer on the earth." Then Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to endure. Look, you are driving me off the land today, and I must hide from your presence. I will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "All right then, if anyone kills Cain, Cain will be avenged 7 times as much." Then the Lord put a special mark on Cain so that no one who found him would strike him down. So Cain went out of the presence of the Lord and lived in the land of Nod, to the east of Eden. Okay, so there are so many things to unpack here, but we have to understand what's just happened in light of everything that came before it, because everything is interconnected. The story that came before it, what happened with Adam and Eve in the fall, and the effects of the fall. So one of the most prominent aspects of this story is that it is the first death that we have in the Bible, death of a person at least, because we assume that an animal had to die to clothe Adam and Eve with skins, right? Which is also a significant detail that I won't really chase down today, because how they clothed themselves prior to this was with fig leaves. That's what they used when they were hiding from God. But there's an Old Testament symbolism in using animal sacrifices to cover up the mistakes or self-consciousness of human beings, right? But I won't go into that. It's a really fun thing to go into, but for the sake of time. But also you have Abel's sacrifice, which we're assuming is the firstborn, the fattest of the flock, that an animal had to die for that. But this is the first instance of imago Dei, or those who were made in the image of God, experiencing the results of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, humanity was warned that when you eat of the fruit of this tree, you will surely die. Now, when Adam and Eve ate of this fruit, they didn't just drop dead instantly. That's not what the story tells us. So it kind of seemed true that maybe the snake was telling the truth when he said, "Oh, you will not surely die when you eat of this fruit." But the death that God was talking about, the death that God warned us about, wasn't really due to any physical poisoning of the fruit, right? It wasn't something that really affected the body per se. It was a poisoning of the mind, spiritual poisoning. And it's a poison that ran through the veins of the family tree straight into Cain. And here in this story, it's this pattern that stamps itself across every page of the Bible going forward. You see it everywhere, all throughout the Old Testament, all the way up to Jesus. Whether it's Cain killing Abel, or Joseph being thrown into a pit by his brothers, Esau plotting to kill Jacob, or King Saul hunting down David, it's this pattern of sin, of envy, pride, violence. It runs through the veins of humanity, culminating in the ultimate tragedy, right, of Jesus himself being killed by his own brothers, his fellow Jews, the religious leaders, and even his disciples betrayed him. They denied him, handed him over to be crucified. And why did they do this? Why? What's the common thread in all these stories? Why is brother killing brother? What do all these people have in common? Well, they were all caught naked. They were all exposed, feeding from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were trapped in their pride, trapped in their self-interests, and then God moves in one way, shape, or form, walking among them, calling them to accountability, and suddenly the truth hits them, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have it both ways. You can't serve yourself and God at the same time. And in this moment of failure, kind of like a wounded animal, these people, brother killing brother, they do the unthinkable thing, right? And what's often easier and more expedient than admitting fault, changing, rising to the challenge, what's often easier and more expedient than that is to level the playing field by cutting others down, right? And people do this because they refuse to let go of the things that they love, the things that benefit them, make them feel important. And Cain couldn't hold on to his best crops and offer his best crops to God at the same time, right? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, they can't be worshipped by men, praised by men, and still genuinely be people who are epitomized as worshiping and praising God, or ideal individuals that do that, right? The rich young ruler, he can't have his wealth and have eternal life at the same time. Ananias and Sapphira, they can't be selfish and also be seen as generous at the same time. All these people that I just mentioned, they suffered the same fate as Cain, right? They were cast out of the presence of God. They were spewed from the mouth of God. They were found to be lukewarm. And the tension is undeniable. We're all faced with this same choice, right? Either we surrender everything to God, or we keep trying to hold on to what we think is ours. And God will expose where our hearts truly lie in his own time. And the greatest lie that you will ever be told is that you can eat from both trees, or that you can have it both ways. The consequences of our self-consciousness, our pride, our selfishness, this propensity that we have to think that the universe revolves around us. It's not just some internal monster that we battle in the privacy of our own minds, right? It perpetually exists as this predator within us, one that's always crouching at the door, ready to pounce. And this was God's warning to Cain, right? And I think we would be shocked to realize how much closer we all are to Cain than we are to Abel. Every single one of us. And I would just think of how many times we've given way to the sin that's crouching at our door, ready to escape through our mouths, cutting down those people that we call our brothers and sisters. Like, this isn't just some cute little Bible story for kids. It can be, but it's our story. It's our history. It's our memories. It's our faults. It's our flaws. The story of Cain and Abel, it's meant to be a reminder that you and me, that sometimes we're only a small wound away from becoming a monster ourselves. It reminds us that the greatest enemy to our faith probably is not a Muslim in the Middle East. It's probably not a blue-haired liberal living in downtown LA, and it's definitely not an atheist or an unbeliever, right? We're reminded that the greatest enemy to us is us. It's within us. It's our self-interest. It's our self-consciousness that is crouching at the door, tempting you to indulge, to eat of the tree, to be like God, to think of yourself first, to consider what you want before anybody else. But thanks be to God, the God who offered mercy even to Cain when he asked. That same God offers mercy to us, that while we were enemies of his, he died for us. He died for those same brothers that condemned him to death, right? We are, if we're being honest with ourselves, we're Cain. But the beautiful news is that he's Jesus. And if the story of Cain and Abel is a warning for us to show us the utter depravity of human nature, then the gospel is a story that shows the utter grace and mercy of God's nature, right? Sin, it may be crouching at the door, but Jesus is also knocking at the door, and he's knocking for you. And that's what the story of the Bible is trying to communicate from the beginning to the end.